Good morning, everyone. The Class Play podcast was after dark yesterday, and now we're back in the light. Another day at the draft. Day 2 coming up. A lot of great questions. I'm joined here today by Tej Seth, Brown. Tej, how you doing?
I'm doing great. I think we went late last night, but had to come back on and talk day 2 preview today. We talked a lot about day 1. Yesterday did an hour and a half. We were up until, 2:30 in the morning, still talking about the draft, but had to get up early this morning again to do it as well.
Awesome. And Ben just got done with a radio hit out in Vegas. What were they asking? What were some of the questions they were excited about?
Yeah, I mean, it was a lot of the discourse that we're obviously hearing here. I think my Vikings have very much taken a leading role in some of the analysis talk today, which is intriguing. The Falcons as well very much are a heavily discussed team, and I do think people are very much curious about some more broad, general analytic type trends or things that we can kind of glean from how all these teams kind of approach the first round. I think all of them make for some really interesting discussions as we head towards day 2 for sure.
For sure. And so as discussed, 32 players off the board. We now have a kind of a fresh new outlook of teams having new needs, looking at players that potentially dropped or looking at players that they potentially have a higher value than the league on. And so this kind of discussion gets interesting at the first pick of the second round, obviously, with the Bills having traded Stephon Diggs, are probably in the market for a wide receiver. Tej, what are your thoughts on kind of what their options are there and how they may move forward?
I do like some of the moves that the Bills made yesterday to get back, out of the first round and pick up a couple of draft picks along the way. And you're right, like this is the spot where we would like to take wide receivers. We thought that there was a clear top 3, but then after that, all these wide receivers are kind of mixed together, and it's really just the value of the rookie contract that's going to generate the surplus value for you. And I think that the Bills are going to get that here. I think when you look at some of the receivers remaining, Adonai Mitchell from Texas is someone who wasn't super productive his last year, but obviously tested very well, is highly athletic, highly talented. So maybe that's an option for them, someone that can turn into a true number 1 receiver for them. Ladd McConkey, I think, is also another option because he would work really well with Khalil Shakir in that offense where they're both guys who should be able to separate, work over the intermediate areas of the field where Josh Allen can really get to them. And then Keon Coleman can be your true big body X receiver, not great separation wise, but really good at contested catchability. And I think that as the Bills continue to work on their wide receiver room, building it up in the aggregate since the Stephon Diggs trade, one of these guys can be like the start of that, and then they can move on and take another receiver later in the draft.
The Bills are in an interesting situation too, because, this is a team that's competed year after year after year and hasn't been able to get over the hump. They move off from a wide receiver generally viewed over the past couple of years, one of the better ones. Obviously now bringing in a younger guy, they have Khalil Shakir, who, analytically looks like a great wide receiver and is going to get a lot more reps. Ben, we had Arjun Menon on yesterday, Chargers super fan, PFF analyst. He was kind of pulling his hair out at the pick, but it seems as if the Chargers are in a pretty good spot to get a wide receiver. Who do you like to see go there?
Yeah, definitely. Obviously, within the first 5 picks, basically, kind of like Tej said, like there are a number of guys in this, like I would classify it closer to maybe like the borderline second, third tier of wide receiver prospects basically we have, but it is very much, I would say, flavor of what you really value, right? And I do think, at least from the Bills standpoint, like I believe in Khalil Shakir, and I do think he could be a really legitimate slot receiver. But not only do they have to fill the Stephon Diggs role, but they very much probably need to get a legitimate threat like Gabe Davis, or hopefully somebody better than Gabe Davis. I think is like a key point of that offense. So I would be surprised if they didn't come away in the next 2 days with multiple receivers that can potentially fill that position. And I think the Chargers are in a lot of ways, not necessarily in the same position, because I actually don't think they have like any real, strong, I would say, presence at the wide receiver position that I'm really going to buy into. I think, Josh Palmer is obviously somebody that can maybe bring you a little bit of that traditional X receiver type look, a la Gabe Davis, but they're a team that I think at least needs to go all in on the wide receiver position here in day 2 and day 3. And I think overall, like to me, I would rather see a guy like A.D. Mitchell go to the Chargers. I think, like, obviously his target share and his, the things in which he needs to do from like a yards per route run perspective didn't really carry forward at Texas. And I think that's one of the main reasons why he was dinged so much. But obviously, heavy competition for targets in that offense. I still think he, at least from like a measurement standpoint, has the capabilities of actually leading an NFL, wide receiver room in certain stretches. So he would be the guy that I'd be looking at pick 37 for the Los Angeles Chargers. But kind of like Tej said, there are a number of options, but I think the Chargers in particular more so need to go with like a traditional wide receiver type look. And I think the Bills could maybe get away with maybe taking more of the, a little bit of a different approach, or have more options, I would say, to really fill the void that they have on the offensive side of football for them.
Right. We were discussing prior to the show how, you go into the draft and there are certain positions, and wide receiver was one of them this year, where, you may be able to wait until that second round. I mean, you look at the guys who are still on the board: A.D. Mitchell, Ladd McConkey, Keon Coleman. These are all guys who a lot of people thought could go in the first round. I mean, you look at the EDPs respectively down that line: EDP 28 for A.D. Mitchell, 32 Ladd McConkey, 33 just outside of the first round with Keon Coleman. And Tej had a good point about, when you're evaluating how these guys will actually fit in, there's a lot of target share questions. There's a lot of quarterback questions. Can you walk the crowd through kind of what your thought process was on that, and also how it deals in a fantasy context?
Yeah. So when you look at these players, in the types of situations they might end up in, both from how well they can actually develop once they're there, but also from a fantasy standpoint. We talked about this last night, but like Josh Palmer is someone right now that is projected to be top 5 in target share next year by default, mostly because the Chargers just haven't made much of an investment at wide receiver. Draft position is the biggest predictor of target share your rookie season, but when these players get taken at let's say number 3 or number 37 overall, there will be a pretty strong target share opportunity for them, just because of what was lost from both the Bills and the Chargers last season. So there will be room for them to get targets pretty early as a rookie, as long as they feel comfortable in those situations. So like, that's why I think it would be really exciting to see both the Bills and the Chargers take receivers at 33 and 37, because that opportunity, all those targets are available for them. And it's like, you think back to like the Moneyball scene, like the famous one, like, yeah, you want to build up those targets in the aggregate with multiple receivers that can really replace what Stephon Diggs and Keenan Allen were doing for the Bills and Chargers respectively.
Yeah. And Ben, a question I have for you: with both of these teams, they have settled and pretty well proven quarterbacks with good tackle situations. Obviously, the Chargers made an investment even more at tackle. Like, these are offenses that are kind of set. And so just in general, kind of irrespective of who gets drafted, what would you expect the better fantasy outcome to be if you're just looking at someone tied to a Josh Allen or someone tied to a Justin Herbert?
Yeah, I think, and going back to it, like, I think both landing spots are going to have a ton of upside and appeal. And I do think, like, there are certain guys that are, if they get drafted to either one of these teams at 32 or 37, are probably going to be more intriguing than, what happens with Ricky Pearsall for San Francisco from a fantasy perspective, right? So I think, and to me, like, the intriguing part about what we're discussing is, like, there are kind of still wide receivers that kind of fit almost any mold. And I think the direction in which each one of these teams go is going to be a really interesting part of the top of the first round. Because if you want a slot guy, like, there are some slot guys maybe a little bit further on down the draft board, but those options still very much exist. And guys like Jacob Cowing, I think, Roman Wilson in particular is a guy that I'm intrigued where he actually ends up as well. But I think overall, like, the talent at the wide receiver position is so deep right now, and we've kind of hit the maybe the starting to the midpoint of that. But very much it's going to be, at least the fantasy success, driven by that initial opportunity. And I'm not quite sure if I believe that any one of these guys is like more NFL ready than anyone else. I think obviously some are going to be more of a development project, but somebody who I think can, maybe come in and step out right away does seem like it would be like more of a Ladd McConkey type. So I think if he ends up in one of those two spots, that would be a case to, potentially get a little bit more excited from like a fantasy standpoint.
Yeah. Sure. And to add on to what you're saying, like, we do have alignment with data from StatsBomb, and it's really interesting to look at, like, how many yards are you away from the ball width wise, like from the ball to the sideline, at the snap. And Ricky Pearsall is someone who had the lowest of the top 16 receivers. He was most often lined up closest to the ball. But then you bring up some other options like Malachi Corley from Western Kentucky was someone who lined up in the slot a lot. Ladd McConkey, had the fifth lowest alignment. And then you can kind of go to the other end with some of the receivers we might be taking today. With Keon Coleman, who's like basically a true X receiver, like lining up on the outside very often. A.D. Mitchell was somewhere in the middle there, where he was mostly lining up on the inside, but could get close to the ball eventually as well. So it's like, yeah, you're right. Like whatever flavor of wide receiver you really want today at the top of the draft, you should be able to get it. And I think that will continue all the way through day 2.
Yeah, and I'm glad we're getting into some of these other wide receivers as well. It is such a deep position. Asa Arnold, who recently contributed to Sumer Sports, got to take kind of his victory lap yesterday when Michael Penix went 8, brings up Javon Baker from UCF. There's just a lot of kind of flavors, as you kind of said, of where people want to go with that. Obviously, there's some opportunities to trade back, perhaps, depending on who you like. Just to kind of close out the wide receiver conversation here, we have all this long list of guys. Who do y'all think is, just from the data perspective, is the guy to look out for, irrespective of role, Tej?
Yeah, I mean, that is a really good question. I think Ben mentioned it with Ladd McConkey. Like, I think he's someone who can step in day one and be a pretty good option because of his versatility and alignment, where he can line up in the slot and outside. And I think he was probably the most liked and respected player in this draft. Like, maybe didn't have the high-end talent to go in the first round, but like I rarely saw anything bad from him, any knocks on him. Like some of my other guys that I really liked in this class, like Troy Franklin, film guys weren't as high on because of his drop rate and his low contested catch rate. Like I also really like Jermaine Burton from a data perspective, but there was the character concerns. Like Ladd McConkey was universally like really liked in this class. And, if he doesn't end up working out in the NFL, I think both data people and film people would be surprised by that.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I like that you bring up Jermaine Burton too. There's just a lot of firepower here. Ben, where do you think the most firepower is concentrated in one player?
Yeah, I mean, I personally like, obviously Jermaine Burton has some like off the field concerns, but I do think he is like the best option as far as like a complete wide receiver that you can still get right now. And I think in a lot of ways he's like, kind of like, not, I don't want to say like a complete poor man's version of Marvin Harrison Jr., but I think he does have like the top end talent to basically run almost every single route on the football field. And I think, obviously the off field concerns are something, but that's the reason why he did slide out of the first round and could even, slide out of the second round as well. So for Burton, to me, is like a high upside case. I obviously like, don't grind the film like a lot of other people, and I'm not as concerned about drops. So I do think Troy Franklin as well as at least showed like legitimate separation type skills. Obviously, he didn't get to showcase that a lot in Oregon's offense in this last season with the low ADOT, coming from Bo Nix, but I think he has shown separation ability at basically every single level. And I think that's an intriguing case in the second round, especially if he's a guy that you kind of need to build your wide receiver room around.
Yeah, and someone we haven't talked a ton about is Keon Coleman. And if you want to pinpoint a time in which Keon Coleman went from, certified first round player to all of a sudden he's fallen back into the second, was his 4.61 40. Tej, you've written an article about how much that kind of affects wide receivers at the next level, or at least how much we can glean from it. Obviously, he also had a tracking wise when he was running the gauntlet drill, the fastest, miles per hour there. So do you think that Keon Coleman has maybe fallen too far? I know that there was a lot of scouting stuff as well and things like that describing, how he's generally not separating. What does your data say about Keon Coleman, and how does that kind of show where he may go today and how he may project into the NFL?
Yeah, I mean, you bring up a lot of good points there. I think when you look at Keon Coleman, his production was pretty low at Florida State this past year, like 14th in yards per out run out of the top 16 receivers we had. But what he did do pretty well was he was targeted deep a lot from Jordan Travis, and he was explosive on a lot of those deep targets. So he's really someone that when you watch him, he looks a lot better than the stats end up showing. And I think that's reflective in some of the film guys that I've talked to. Like when they're looking at him, like they're a lot higher on him than the data would show. just because of that. But he did finish with a 38th percentile athleticism score, which is slightly predictive, but obviously like when you bring up tracking data, like I think he's going to show up better in that. And like, despite his 40, he still did really well in the broad jump and vertical. And he has the right height and weight that you kind of want to see from a typical like bigger body receiver in the NFL. So he's someone that's going to be a super interesting evaluation for me going forward, because like there's a disparity between the data and what you see, with him when you actually turn on the film. He probably ends up somewhere in the middle, but I wouldn't be surprised if he falls on either end of the distribution.
Yeah. I think for me, like, and I think there's been quite a bit of pushback, rightfully so, on like the contested catch artists. I do think Keen Coleman, like in particular, has a lot of like wow type plays that jump off the page because of like that contested catch ability. And I do think it'll be really interesting to see kind of where he lands, because I do think he is, better from an overall wide receiver package than a guy like JJ Arcega-Whiteside, who very much had the similar, a similar contested catch knock. I personally, with Keen Coleman, see like almost flashes of T. Higgins. That's very much like an upside case, but T. Higgins was a guy who fell to the 33rd pick in the second round as well because of the overall, I would say, athletic profile. But I very much think like an upside case for Keen Coleman could be along that T. Higgins type line for sure.
Yeah, and so to kind of close this conversation out, you bring up T. Higgins. There are a lot of rumors going around about possibly a wide receiver being traded. Brandon Ayuk obviously came up yesterday, texting to the front office and Kyle Shanahan that the Ricky Pearsall pick was fire. Ayuk's possibly in the mix. Are there any trades that y'all expect coming up today, maybe, or after the draft?
I do think Deebo Samuel has the highest chance of those three receivers of getting traded, him, Ayuk, and T. Higgins, just because I don't know if he necessarily fits with the 49ers long-term plan. And you're going to start to get really expensive. I think they're going to have either 5 or 6 players that are getting paid over $20 million per year once Ayuk gets his extension. So I think Deebo Samuel might be the guy that's left out there, where his production's dropped a little bit. He's not what he used to be in 2021, but I think he's still someone that could be effective for a team that is a little bit more desperate for receivers, as long as they're comfortable taking on the cap hit. Like maybe, the Commanders end up giving a 4th or 5th round pick for him and kind of handling his cap hit because they have the space to do so, because they really want to help Jaden Daniels get acclimated to the league. Like I think those are the types of teams we could watch for as potential trade candidates for him.
Right. Any trades that you expect, Ben?
I mean, yeah, I'm fully on with the Deebo Samuel. I do think just in general, like the compensation that fans and everyone else have been kind of projecting from the wide receiver position, I think has been very overblown. I think in, a lot of ways, maybe that doesn't carry with what Stephon Diggs got from the Houston Texans, with the 2nd round pick. But I do think just in general, like Deebo getting moved for a 3rd or 4th round pick wouldn't surprise me whatsoever. And I do think there are a number of teams, even given his contract, that would probably be willing to do it. So I think it's probably maybe more of a likelihood than not, close to a coin flip, that he ends up getting moved, especially after the Ricky Pearsall move for them yesterday, I would say.
Yeah, and one of the things that really it seemed like the 49ers liked about Ricky Pearsall was speed. And so Sean Donahue is jumping into the chat. Thanks, long-time viewer Sean. We very much appreciate you. He says, do you think teams will prioritize speed because it fits a role? He also asked about Tez Walker there. Tej and Ben, any thoughts about how speed may affect the draft order today for the wide receivers?
I do think that's a fair point to bring up, right? Because when we look at GMs and some of their trends in the draft, there's some GMs where they will try to take premium positions, or they'll try to take best player available on day 1. But then day 2 and day 3 is really about chasing highly athletic players that give yourself a chance to have someone break out and really go past their draft position. When you look at Tez Walker, very weird season where he had to wait for a decision from the NCAA to see if he could play. I'm sure that affected him mentally, and the production wasn't great, despite Drake May throwing to him, but he still had a decent amount of separation and a decent amount of target share. So maybe he can turn that into something at the next level. But where he really shined was at the combine, 97th percentile predictive athletic score. Despite being 193 pounds, he still ran a 4.36. He did very well in the vertical, very well in the broad jump. Things that are both predictive for wide receivers. So maybe a team does take a chance on him today, despite the production being low, just because the athleticism is there, and he can run a pretty diverse route tree. And I think that a team might try to take advantage or try to take a chance on that and really use them to their advantage.
Yeah, that sounds great. And also from Sean, we have shout out Mike Renner with the Arcega Whiteside drop. Ben, everybody's appreciating your deep knowledge of the game.
Deep knowledge. I mean, yeah, and I think with the Walker thing in particular, like this is something that I've personally been, like interested in, like, wanting to research or something, but we do see athletic profile carry, I would say, in seemingly every single position, right? And especially if a guy like Devontae Walker is thought of as maybe struggling from like a technique aspect with his route running ability, like those are things that I think NFL scouts and evaluators believe that they can fix and correct when they get that guy in the building. And I think that's the reason why we do see, the speed and the athleticism carry so much from a draft signal standpoint. And I very much think that, Walker in particular kind of fits that bill, because if you have like a route running technician without a lot of speed, like there's not a lot of like wiggle room, I would say, from that team actually being really successful and bringing out the best in him, because a lot of that has already been, shown on film. But I think from a Walker standpoint, like Tej said, he missed a lot of time, wasn't maybe in the correct headspace when he was out there, but he did have the flashes. Very limited from a route tree standpoint, but I think if that can be developed, he is somebody that could be a very intriguing day 2 prospect and could be a really legitimate, wide receiver 2 option on a good NFL offense for sure.
Right. And before we move on off of wide receivers, obviously one of the most important fantasy positions, I do want to reiterate to the crowd that we are partnering with Underdog Fantasy for all of these streams. We're bringing you stuff all weekend long. And so you can use promo code SUMER for 100% match up to $100 on Underdog Fantasy. So we'll move to kind of back into the trenches. There's a lot of great D linemen right now that are still on the board. Obviously, one of my favorite prospects of the whole draft cycle, Johnny Newton, is still on the board. And there's a lot of kind of need at that defensive lineman position. Yeah. We also saw, someone like Byron Murphy go ahead of edges, and now it seems like this interior defensive line is now a standard premium position now. So a couple other guys who are on the board: Braden Fisk, EDP of 31, T'Vondre Sweat, much later, EDP of 61, but it's just cratered after some off the field issues. But a lot of guys think his athletic profile is pretty good. Maybe someone takes a jump on him. Ben, what are your thoughts on kind of this D-line group? Obviously, the Vikings may, dabble in this market in the next couple of rounds. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I very much agree with your, a synopsis, basically, that the interior defensive line position has very much taken hold as like a premium position. And although it maybe hasn't like completely front run the cornerback position, like teams are moving in that direction because of, the proliferation of like the too high shell look and everything else, and needing a guy that can play both gaps, in the interior of the defensive line. So I think both come off the board. Kind of like you said, the T'Vondre Sweat obviously has some, weight concerns and then like the off the field stuff with the DUI, but he is a guy, if you can get him in the building, like there are very few people that can move as quickly as he can at the weight in which he actually carries forward. And I think that is an impact type player. And if you can get those guys in the second round, like that's when you really have, a team building momentum that can carry you to, a legitimate Super Bowl contender if you get enough guys and you hit on enough of those picks. And we've seen teams like, the Philadelphia Eagles continuously, make some of those hits in the rounds past the first round. So I do think gravitating towards upside in the second and third round, it makes a lot of sense. And I think, Sweat and Newton in particular have a lot of that skill set already baked in. And I think very much will be coming off the board, I would say, relatively quickly here on Friday.
Right. And so another interesting thing to note is Fisk was kind of a combine riser. We've written about combine risers and how maybe that won't track exactly to, an increased value and approximate value as measured by Football Reference. And then you look at T'Vondre Sweat and Jerjon Newton, the medicals are a little strange on Sweat, obviously some character issue stuff. Tej, when you're looking at this market in which, number one, it's kind of an upswing market. People are viewing it as a premium position, as Ben highlighted. And then you're also looking at guys who are kind of drastically falling from a 20 EDP for Newton. Sweat dropped weeks ago, or drastically rising like Braden Fisk. What's your kind of view of how to play the middle and really reap value in the draft, and kind of reading the tea leaves of this variance?
That's a really good question. I mean, I think your guys' article on combine risers and why we should sometimes be wary of them is really spot on when we look at all of this, because when you think about these evaluations, the combine should mostly confirm what you saw for most positions, right? There are exceptions. I think like tight end, for example, is a position where the combine impacts how they're actually going to perform in the NFL a lot, because of just like how highly athletic you have to be to play tight end at a high level in the league. But for most other positions, you shouldn't move players up 10, 15 spots on your big board just because of the combine. But there are certain things that can help you think about what you want to kind of what the type of mold that you want for a player to be in at the next level. And I think when you look at T'Vondre Sweat, removing some of the off-field stuff and just focusing on him as a player, like Ben mentioned, it's really hard to find someone at that size that can move at the speed that he moved on. He had a 97th percentile predictive athletic score from us. He's someone who is really good at wreaking havoc in the backfield, had the 4th highest havoc rate among the top 8 defensive tackles, had the 3rd highest or the 3rd lowest depth of tackle. So that's really good. He's getting in the backfield often, playing next to Byron Murphy and really making sure he's tackling rushers behind the line of scrimmage. But again, like, you don't know about how he's going to be able to sustain a full game at the NFL level just because of his weight, and it's really hard to do so. Kind of goes back to the Jordan Davis thing, where I think Davis has had a fine NFL career, but definitely not at the level that you wanted it to. I think Jalen Carter is someone who's had already a really good NFL career because he's a little bit lighter, because he was a little bit more flexible. But I do want to really hear from you on Johnny Newton, because he's someone who got a lot of pressure, got the pressure quickly, rushing from that defensive tackle spot, had an EDP of 24.5 yesterday, and has fallen to the 2nd round.
Right. It's interesting. And I think the medicals in this draft have played an interesting role, because obviously at the premium-ist, the most premium position, quarterback, we have Penix pop all the way up to 8. Obviously he hasn't been like overly injured in the past couple of years, but then we see on the defensive side of the ball, like Dallas Turner fall a little bit to the Vikings, and then they trade up and get him. And obviously we've seen Newton fall. I'll also think there's just the greater trend, which I think we'll get into later, of these defensive players being drafted later. And I'm kind of still working through, and maybe by the end of the podcast, I'll have like a better view of it just after we continue talking of what does this mean kind of for the draft or for the league as a whole, that people are really trying to jump up and reap value from the quarterbacks. Maybe this is just a class thing. I thought this was one of the better kind of, but also more top-heavy defensive tackle classes. And so I thought that there may be people come up and trying to snipe it, as some of the later defensive tackles aren't projected to be as good in the NFL. But it seems like maybe they'll just slot in the early 2nd round, and the teams that needed them obviously may have traded back or up or something like that. And we'll see how it breaks down. And kind of along this role as well, Sean has another fantastic question for you guys. Do you think teams should prioritize inside-outside versatility or role players? I think this comes back a lot to Johnny Newton, so I'll kind of lead it off. Johnny Newton does have that inside-outside versatility. Health notwithstanding, you'd expect him kind of to be a guy much like a Byron Murphy from Texas, where I thought they were kind of similar players. Byron Murphy obviously did at a higher level. Some of the analytics are great. But you look at both of them, and they have that inside-outside versatility. And I think that's something that means a lot in the 1st round. And I'd like to get a view from y'all. Tej, you kind of just hit on it with the kind of Jordan Davis breakdown. But is this a place where you start looking for a Jonah Ellis type DPR, where they're just coming off the edge on, 2nd, 3rd down passing downs? Or are you still looking for that all-in kind of home run player?
Yeah, I mean, this is an awesome question from Sean. I think like the kind of the cop out is like it really depends on your rotation, right? Like there's teams like the Jets that rotate a ton of defensive linemen through, and they can have someone like Bryce Huff, who's played that role for them last year, the designated pass rusher role. I think like someone like James Houston did that for the Lions. So like kind of depends on where you're at with there, or there's other teams that like to play, their defensive linemen a ton on the field. I think we're about to see that with the Raiders this year with Christian Wilkins and Max Crosby, where they're going to be on the field on basically every single defensive snap. So it really depends on your defensive philosophy. But I think from a draft perspective, early round 2 is still where you want to try to find that versatility. I think when you have players that can line up from the 3 technique to the 5 technique, or you have a 4-eye out wide where they can get flexed out. I think we've seen how successful the Chiefs have been, where they can move Chris Jones all over the place. And we saw him kind of move in games like the Super Bowl, where he can kind of find the weak link on your offensive line and attack it. Myles Garrett has been very similar. I think back to the Bengals game from week 1, where they had him lining up over the center because that was the weak point of the Bengals offensive line at the time. So like that's really like the versatility you can get in the top 40, top 50 picks is what you want to chase. And then on day 3, go after your highly athletic guys, go after some of the small school guys who racked up double-digit amount of sacks or high-end amount of pressures last year, because like if they showed either production and or athleticism, they can really fill one of the designated roles for you, where either they're a designated pass rusher at edge, or there's someone like T'Vondre Sweat who's going to play early downs for you and really try to make it where teams are playing in more 3rd and 6s and less 3rd and 4s.
Right. And I think, Ben, you're close to the situation now. Obviously, you've added Dallas Turner, who's looked at as, kind of a kind of all-around outside linebacker. Our partner, Sean Syed at Syed Schemes, was in the press conference and asking just great, fantastic questions. And I'm glad that we've gotten a lot of feedback. So huge shout out to Sean. But he asked a question about Dallas Turner being comfortable dropping, looking at that versatility, kind of a certified day 1 guy. The Vikings also have, I think it's Jonathan Greenard and Andrew Van Ginkel.
Yep.
And so now that you're moving into your team is your favorite team is moving into day 2, are you looking for more of those guys that Tej just outlined, of guys that are forcing you into the 3rd and 6th so you can unleash a Turner, a Van Ginkel, or a Greenard? Or are you still looking for like the hot shot guys that can fit into Flores' scheme and become absolutely dominant?
Yeah, I'm still looking and gravitating towards like the upside plays. I think obviously, what Tej said carries. I also think it makes a lot of sense. To me, I think our projection and understanding of versatility, especially at the college level, maybe needs to be correctly grounded in what that player actually has to do in the situation in which he finds himself in at the college level as well, right? Because I do think in a lot of ways, like, guys are asked to do certain things at the college level more so out of need than ability. And I think just, separating those two things, like in a lot of situations, we look at the traditional base rates for what that guy did in different schemes, and maybe don't necessarily understand like the context in which he arrived at that particular situation, whether he's rushing from the inside or the outside, and what the context of the game actually is. So I do think it's a good question. To me, if I was, rebuilding the, Vikings defensively, I do think they have a decent amount of depth at the edge rusher position now, kind of like you said with, Jonathan Greenard, Andrew Van Ginkel. Obviously they have Dallas Turner as well. They have a couple more depth pieces. I think, specifically they have Harrison Phillips as well, who I think has been, relatively successful coming over to the Minnesota Vikings from the Buffalo Bills. But I still think they need, a legitimate run stuffing nose tackle to operate in this 3-4 scheme and allow the guys, I would say, to kind of get after the quarterback. So I do think cornerback is still in some ways a need as well. They have spent a decent amount of draft capital in prior seasons and haven't really had, a ton of it. But I do think where their secondary is at is concerning. Once they do end up moving on from Harrison Smith, like they are going to have, I would say, needs at basically every single one of the secondary positions. So I do think getting depth there, taking some shots, and then maybe getting the nose tackle and like, the rounds 4 or later is maybe more so the correct approach. But the Vikings just don't have a ton of, draft capital type options coming up here at all, really, over the next 2 seasons.
Yeah, and Asa kind of reiterates this point of he would have loved Minnesota traded back and took Newton late first. Obviously, that's in our mock draft. That's how I wrote it. I really like to see him in a Vikings uniform and playing for Flores. And so I think this is all interesting and a kind of great segue into kind of our discussion of the secondary. One of the more surprising things about from yesterday was basically how the corners just started dropping into the 20s. And then we kind of saw a little run on them. And there was some expectation that maybe we'd see a Kool-Aid McKinstry, who you mentioned that Nick Saban said is like the 1A with Terrion Arnold, Cooper DeJean, and it's Rakestraw. What's kind of the overarching view, Tej, of how these corners drop? Do you think there's something to glean for the future, or you think it's just something that's product of this draft class?
I do think it's really interesting because when I looked at how draft capital has changed at a position level over time, cornerback was the position that has risen the most in terms of draft capital spent on it since 2011, right? If you look at just kind of the trend line for corners, there's been more and more draft capital spent on it. And I thought that's kind of was going to be how this draft bore out. Like I looked at teams like the Raiders at number 13, the Colts at 15, even the Vikings when they went up to 17. Like I look at all of those teams as possible and even probable cornerback destinations, and that isn't how it played out yesterday. So that was surprising to me to really see the corner run start with the Eagles at 22, and then the Lions taking Terrion Arnold at 24, and now you have some corners remaining here. It was really interesting to see the Ravens go with Nate Wiggins at 30. Mm-hmm. Because maybe they were a trade back candidate where they could have traded back into the second round and picked up either Kool-Aid McKinstry or Cooper DeJean. But Nate Wiggins is a very high profile corner prospect. Obviously, the only thing holding him back was his weight. So it'll be interesting to follow today is maybe the league wants to switch from taking some of these corners in the first round where they might have to come out and guard wide receiver ones early on in their process, and that might hinder the development, to taking so many dart throws at the position like we saw the Buccaneers do when they won the Super Bowl, where they had multiple drafts where they were spending 3-4 day 2, day 3 picks on cornerback, on defensive back in general. The Bengals, I think, had a similar strategy. They just did it through free agency when their defense was at their peak a couple of years ago. So maybe that's how teams want to see corner now, like where the draft capital has risen so much where now they think that it's too pricey of a draft pick to pay to take them in the top 10, top 15, and they want to wait a little bit more on them now.
Yeah, and that makes a lot of sense. And so, Tej, you've also done some work on, free agency and the cornerback position, obviously, as well. And Sean chimes in here. I believe he's talking about the Vikings covered bare for 25 with the draft capital, but they have a sizable amount of cap space in 25. Maybe they're confident that they can pay for certainty in the defensive backfield. What are your thoughts on that?
I do think that's a good point to bring up there, where it ended up being very, very expensive to get up and get Dallas Turner for the Vikings yesterday, just because of it was a double trade up. You had to pay the trade tax twice. If Dallas Turner's medicals are okay, we're talking about a player who a lot of people expected to go in the top 10, top 12, that you got at number 17. Is it still probably an overpay in the grand scheme of things? Yeah, but like it goes back to what the Texans were trying to do last year, where you need to build your core before you can fill in some of the outside pieces. And I think when we look at trade charts, they are really good at usually projecting value. I think there's been so much research done on why the benefits of trading back and not reaching are important, but you're trying to build a young core of players. And I think that's what the Vikings are trying to do, where they're hoping that on offense, their core is J.J. McCarthy throwing to Justin Jefferson, Jordan Addison, T.J. Hockenson, and their 2 tackles. They're hoping on defense that their core is Jonathan Greenard and Dallas Turner, and even Ivan Pace, maybe you can throw in
Right.
there, like, and they're going to try to fill in the pieces around that in 2025 in the free agency class because of their lack of draft capital.
Right. And so moving on from some of the corners, Cooper DeJean and sticking in this idea of, building cores and who has predictive measures, what we can glean. Cooper DeJean's a player that obviously plays corner. A lot of people, for better or worse, think he probably projects out more of a safety.
Yeah.
Ben, do you think that maybe bumps him off of that EDP, given that teams may look at him as kind of in a position that has less value? What are your kind of thoughts there?
Yeah, I very much think that is the signal that we got from him not going in the first round. I think it is interesting because if you look at it like a sports book like DraftKings right now, his odds to go ahead of Kool-Aid McKinstry, who is like very much the traditional cornerback prospect. Like Cooper DeJean's at a minus 165 price to Kool-Aid McKinstry being plus 125. Like the expectation, at least from the betting market, is that DeJean is still going to come off the board before him. So I tend to, I would say, probably lean in the other direction. I personally, and kind of going back to what Tej suggested with like the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, like to round out that secondary to actually be, I would say, like a bona fide legitimate unit. Like they brought in Antoine Winfield Jr. as like a second round pick. And although the safety position isn't necessarily thought of as all that premium, like that is kind of like the glue piece in the secondary. And I very much think that, from the Vikings standpoint, like losing Harrison Smith, they're going to miss out on a lot more than what just losing or missing out on Harrison Smith would actually entail for that secondary. And I do think like maybe going at a less valuable premium position, but solidifying, the safety position with a guy like Tyler Nubin, is maybe a decently sound approach, or maybe getting Cooper DeJean and kind of switching into that safety position. Like there is some value, I would say, in doing that in the second and third round. And we have seen teams at least have some success in doing that and rounding out their secondary and being able to kind of compete for a Super Bowl. And I think that has to be the mindset with how you're kind of approaching both the safety versus cornerback position coming up here on day 2.
Right. That makes a lot of sense. And Ben, I think that's some great insight into if you're approaching some of these odds on Cooper DeJean or Kool-Aid McKinstry. I think that's some great insight about, baking in the positional versatility or more over the positional importance. And so I just want to remind all of our audience, we're working with Underdog Fantasy here. Use promo code SUMER for a 100% match up to $100. Great deal for all of our loyal audience. We have a bunch of great people in the chat right now. And we're talking about positional importance. I think there was a lot of guys, EDPs and top ranking players. We have Jackson Powers Johnson, a center number 1. We have Edgerrin Cooper, linebacker number 1. Jonathan Brooks, who a lot of people are kind of seeing going to the Cowboys, running back number 1. Tyler Nubin, safety number 1. It really wasn't a shock to see any of these guys go round 1. So just as we kind of close out our view of the players who are still on the board, walk me through, Tej, how kind of teams are probably approaching these positions, given that, Fred Warner is one of the bigger stars in the league. However, he does play a non-premium position. We all love running backs, but a non-premium position that's difficult to project out past, 2-3 years. Walk us through kind of your view of some of these players and how they may end up, playing out today.
Yeah, I mean, you're definitely right. Like, it wasn't a surprise to see, all of those guys not go on round 1. I think the only one I was a little bit surprised about was Jackson Powers Johnson, but I think he's another guy where his medicals are more of a concern than we probably know as just fans. Where I think when you looked at these players, both the highest center, the highest linebacker, highest running back, and highest safety, it was both the combination of them being non-premium positions, but also the class of these players just not being as high as it was in the past. I think like you take someone like Jonathan Brooks, for example, where he's a very good running back prospect coming off a torn ACL, not as high end as Bijan Robinson, Jahmyr Gibbs last year, who both went in the top 12. So like he doesn't get that kind of draft capital spent on him, but like someone like him or Trey Benson could go pretty early on day 2 because now teams feel more comfortable using a pick like that on a running back. And Edgerrin Cooper is also someone who shows up really well in the data that we have from StatsBomb, as both a linebacker that can do well in the run game, but also be used off the edge when blitzing and getting pressure on the quarterback. And like, he's not as high of a linebacker prospect as we've seen in recent years, but still someone that teams will now feel more comfortable using a day 2 pick on him than being the only team yesterday that would have drafted someone like a linebacker. Because the draft yesterday, we saw so many premium positions go, and we saw so many offensive players go. So today, maybe teams start to fill in a little bit more on their defense.
Right, and looking at Jonathan Brooks, I mean, at that running back position, I think the Cowboys are kind of getting a lot of flack coming into the draft, given some of the comments from Jerry Jones, and obviously they've been one of the teams who invented the trade chart at the first thing. I think they've done a great job in the draft and refilling their coffers specifically in the past couple years. A lot of people wanted him to go running back in the first round. They made kind of the classic Cowboys pick of going with a high potential, high upside tackle in Guyton from Oklahoma, I believe.
Yep.
And really go kind of chalk to what the analytics would have said to do. You lose long time premium position guy on an offensive line that's typically looked at as pretty good. You kind of fill that need at the position. Obviously, they don't need a quarterback. Dak had a great year last year. Kind of in terms of just sheer positional importance or market value, you fill that role with a tackle. And now, Ben, tell us about how that maybe frees them up to address some of these needs that they need at the less premium positions.
Yeah, definitely. I think, to be honest with you, like the Cowboys, I don't want to say they have a complete roster, but like, they have guys at premium positions that matter a lot. And I think, like you said, the Guyton might be more raw than the other prospects. I think in some ways Cowboys fans might be frustrated as well because they moved down 4 spots, and I think 2 tackles that came off the board in that move down sort of situation. But there's obviously a benefit to them moving down. But I think, I know they don't have a lot on their roster from a running back standpoint. Rico got Dowdle and, Deuce Vaughn, who very much I would say the expectation can't be that he could carry, the lion's share of a load for an NFL offense. So I would expect them to address the position, but the question becomes like how much different of a prospect is Jonathan Brooks as compared to like any other number of the running back prospects that are available, and what are they also going to try and emphasize, right? Because I do think Deuce Vaughn is like a legitimate pass catching running back, obviously similar to like a scat back type option. A lot of sweeps, jet sweeps, those sorts of things. They need somebody that can run between the tackles. To me, maybe a guy like Blake Corum makes more sense than Jonathan Brooks from that angle. But I do think they have like probably their biggest gap is at the middle linebacker position. So I do think Cooper coming off the board here at some point in the second round, specifically to Dallas, does make a lot of sense. And I do think, our discussion around the draft is always around premium positions versus not. But once we move past the first round, like there is like some opportunities to be had in surplus value if you do hit on a guy, even at a non-premium position, given the rookie contract scale. So I would be surprised if we don't see Edgerrin Cooper come off the board relatively quickly, because I do think there's a clear distinction between him and the rest of the inside line. I think the Dallas Cowboys, if we can believe Jerry Jones, etc., and their win now mentality, like I think Edgerrin Cooper is very much the answer to that question as they move into the second round for sure.
Right, and we're starting to get into that team context. But before we do that, I just want to highlight for the audience out there, yesterday was a big quarterbacks and all these big names coming off the board, and we covered that, and I'm glad it worked out with some of our tour of the top 4 stuff. But I was just making notes here about how some of that evergreen stuff, just about the philosophy of the draft, the philosophy of the combine, the philosophy of free agency, really makes a huge difference in the second, third, fourth, fifth rounds. And so for all the audience out there, sumersports.com, if you want to get a sense of what some of these teams might do based off what they did in free agency, based off kind of the theory of the draft, or looking at athletic guys with the combine, Tej and Ben have done a great job of summarizing some of that. And I'm really glad that that some of that is coming to roost. And I'm excited that that's out in the public now. I got to shout out Sean before moving to the next to the next unit here. Ben talking about Deuce Vaughn like he's a young Weldy Moore. He's playing on like this man knows how to get on the show here because he's talking about Deuce Vaughn. Tulane played against Deuce Vaughn, Cowboys guy, Weldy Moore. Tulane guy played at Tulane. Yeah, Vikings legend. Congratulations, Sean. Sean is like the algorithm hacker of the Fast Play podcast.
I love Sean. He's great.
Yeah, appreciate the support, man. So let's move forward. We've kind of stuck in this defensive vein, and I think given that defense has fallen so much, that's going to be the name of the game kind of day 2, and then a little bit less so as people try to find value in day 3. But Tej, I wanted to focus in on one team who is in an interesting place to add a player who can really go big in fantasy, and that's with the Indianapolis Colts. Yesterday, they went with Leitu, who obviously edge rusher, adding to a pretty stout defensive line, and now they're in the position to give Anthony Richardson some help. So they have Josh Downs. So do you think they add in a wide receiver here? And what do you think that wide receiver, in terms of the numbers that you've looked at, what is that wide receiver's opportunity in fantasy? And what does that say about Anthony Richardson, who in the few games that he really popped off last year, he was on one of my teams, really was an impact player in fantasy?
Yeah, I mean, I think the Colts were a team I thought might take Bowers if he was available to them. Ended up being taken a couple picks ahead of where they were drafting. But you look at the Colts from both the fantasy standpoint and just a pass catching group standpoint, like Michael Pittman Jr. is going to be your true wide receiver 1, great player, high-end target share with both Anthony Richardson and Gardner Minshew at quarterback last year. So that tells me Shane Steichen really trusts Michael Pittman Jr. And Josh Downs is also someone in there as well who can be a decent wide receiver too for you. And then the Colts have been really interesting with the way they've invested in their tight end room. They've done it the right way from my perspective. Jelani Woods, highly athletic guy. Mo Alley Cox, highly athletic guy. Maybe they add someone like a Ben Sinnott, a Jaheim Bell today. Like I could see that as an option, give them that personnel diversity that I'm sure Shane Steichen would be really interested on. But I would love to see them take a receiver today, just because supplementing your secondary receiving group, that's really just right now Alec Pierce, and then like sometimes Jonathan Taylor if he comes out the backfield, like giving yourself some extra juice there would really be helpful for Anthony Richardson as he develops. I think that he's someone that the rushing ability, the scramble ability was obviously there last year. I think he ranked 17th or 18th in EPA per play on a very limited sample size, was the best quarterback in the league when pressured last year. But still someone who's going to figure out how to work in structure. So giving him someone who can get open quickly, produce yards after catch for him, I think would be a really great option for them today. And I think they shored up one of their holes yesterday at edge rusher, and I would like to see them really add to it today when they're taking a pass catcher on day 2.
Right, that'll be interesting, and obviously the pass catchers, there's still a couple of teams, very few given the crazy run on quarterbacks that happened yesterday, who are in the market for a quarterback, and one of those obviously is the Giants. A couple quarterbacks on the board, what do you think how do you think the pick yesterday of adding Neighbors? Tej did a really good job of summarizing, they have a lot of speed guys, where speed is the name of the game. They have, a Jalen Hyatt, they have Malik Neighbors now. What do you think the Giants kind of plan for today is?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. I think, most, Giants fans, shout out Pat Powell, like he's the best of the best from a Giants fan standpoint. Like they want at least a longer term solution at the quarterback position. And I think the direction in which they go is going to signal how much they actually buy into Daniel Jones. I do think at some point they are going to address the position. To me, although, we all are fully on board with the Rat Pack and everything else, like I don't think he is probably the correct fit for the New York Giants to back up a guy like Daniel Jones. I think like from fundamentally, like I think there's a case to be made for your guy, Michael Pratt, to potentially be a pretty good backup for a guy like Daniel Jones, similar rushing ability, kind of similar throwing capabilities as well. And I don't know if, as like maybe a long-term starting solution, Michael Pratt could at least develop into a decent use case there. And I think with a guy like Brian DeBoll, like that would be an intriguing pairing that I think actually makes a lot of sense. And maybe
Mhm.
they could wait a little bit longer at the quarterback position, because kind of like, Tage mentioned with the Indianapolis Colts, like I do think the Giants in particular, are sitting as like the third or fourth best team in the NFC West right now, and do have a number of holes. So going in and just like asking a guy to sit for a couple seasons, even if he is, a second round pick, when they do, I would say probably need to, figure out what they have, at the tight end position. I'm not sure what's transpiring with Darren Waller right now, but I do think they in particular as well could be a team that would at least benefit from maybe adding one more weapon as well offensively, in the way in which that looks like. I'm not quite sure, but I also think they probably are in the market for a tight end or a running back here. Maybe not in the second round, but later on in the draft, I think they're very much going to add to those position groups.
Right. And so speaking of that quarterback position, you look at a team like the Raiders, and I was kind of talking with Tej beforehand. I also like Michael Pratt potentially as a fit for the Raiders. And also, a kind of a more general thing that's going on is for years and years and years, the analytics community has been advocating for adding talent at the quarterback position, given it is such a valuable position. If you can lock that down, you can lock down all these other things. We talked about how the Cowboys have done that. You see how the Chiefs can do that year after year after year. And so to a certain point, the Falcons have done that now. They probably spent perhaps the most capital of any team ever in one single year on a quarterback. You see to a certain point as well, the Broncos doing that, though in the free agency trade market side, that's a little less capital, but they've added several players with Zach Wilson there. Also the Pittsburgh Steelers doing that. So so another team in kind of that market to do that is the Raiders, adding Gardner Minshew, drafting Aiden O'Connell last year. Tej, do you think they're in the market for the quarterback, and guys like Devontae Adams? How do you think that affects their fantasy profile?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great point you bring up. Like, I'm sure when the Raiders were planning out their draft, they assumed Michael Penix Jr. would be there often for them at 13. And I'm sure in a lot of their run-throughs, they even went through and ended up picking Michael Penix Jr. just to kind of see like what their roster would look like with that, because they, again, like they didn't really need to take Brock Bowers yesterday. It does give them that personnel diversity we talked about last night, but like they already took Michael Mayer last year as more just a best player available pick. It was probably a pick where they didn't really know what to do after Penix was off the board. So maybe they're a team that does take a quarterback today just to give them another chance to have that. I think Aiden O'Connell was obviously you're not going to expect much from a day 3 pick. And he was someone that didn't really do much last year. I think Gardner Minshew is going to be someone who can give you between the 25th and 35th best quarterback play in the league. So maybe you want that for a year as you figure out where the other holes are on your offense. And I still think that they could be someone that take a quarterback, whether it's today or tomorrow, whether it is Michael Pratt, or maybe you take like the complete long shot on someone like Joe Milton on day 3.
Yeah, and it's fun to kind of have the discussions, and we're still far way out from even rookie camp, training camp, but it's really starting to become real. And for all of our audience who are big fantasy players, I think some of these insights may give you a jump, especially if you're in a dynasty league, of looking forward to the upcoming year. And so again, I just want to say thank you to Underdog Fantasy for supporting us. Use promo code SUMER for 100% match on up to $100. Let's move into kind of the nuts and bolts of the teams before we kind of finish off with a quarterback conversation. Tej, what are some teams that you think's situation may be changed after round 1 or in a good position to make some moves today?
Yeah, so the one I really want to talk about is the Chargers. And you touched on this earlier in the show, but like I think we can really go into detail here. When you look at the Chargers and what they did, taking Joe Alt at number 5 overall, and kind of like how they can shuffle some of their offensive line to get up to having a top 10, maybe top 5 O-line in the NFL, that works well if you supplement that with a wide receiver at 37 today, because we talk about positional scarcity. After the first round, there's a pretty significant drop off in tackle talent. I think, there's a little bit of tackle options today, but clearly not as much as it was yesterday. There's so many wide receiver options today. We went through a lot of them earlier. And like, I think that if the Chargers do end up taking a receiver today, I can see their vision for their decisions Obviously, I still would have gone with Malik Neighbors because I was that high on him as a prospect. But maybe you say like you're getting, 60% of Malik Neighbors is production today at 37, and you're getting 100% of the tackle production. Whereas if you flip that, Malik Neighbors obviously gives you 100% of the receiver production, or 95 compared to Marvis Harrison Jr. But like you're only getting 40% of the tackle production that you would have gotten. So maybe they're kind of playing that positional scarcity card today. So that's definitely one I'm going to watch. Another team that I really have my eye on today is the Cardinals. And what they're going to do on defense. I think the Bears are also in this boat. Both teams walked out with very high-end wide receivers last night, but still have needs at edge and at defensive tackle. So I think maybe the Cardinals go with another edge here because they got someone in Darius Robinson who can kind of play both, and they signed 2 defensive tackles. I think the Bears could go either option as well because we know Matt Eberflus really wants a 3 technique that he can work with. I still think that they could add one more edge to supplement Montez Sweat on the other side. Right. So those are also teams I'm watching to take defensive linemen today.
Right. I love that you bring up that tackle point because you look at kind of the scene today, and there's really only one great tackle of note that is still available. That's Kingsley Suamataia. And there's not a lot left there, but the wide receivers, which we've kind of labored over today, which is really exciting, I think, for some of our audience who's involved in fantasy or involved in betting. And there's a lot of odds that Ben went over, but you're really kind of stuck with a prospect. And I helped cover for ESPN 700 and Spence Checketts out there in Salt Lake. Kingsley Suamataia is probably a 2-3 year project where Joe Alt, the numbers, the combine, you look at kind of his full profile, and he really fits in probably as a day one starter. And so, Ben, what are your kind of thoughts on where teams may go with some of these positions, and maybe there's trade backs? What are you kind of expecting from today?
Yeah, I think in a lot of ways we do project the trades to happen. I would say more so than what they're actually going to. To me, the development of trades from actual NFL players, I think, is going to be the thing that might surprise people, and probably going to be like the main talking point as far as like what NFL players are getting traded for some of these draft picks here, and how does that kind of develop. But I do agree with Tej's point. Like, we all understood the depth at the wide receiver position, and I don't want to say I completely agree with the Chargers going in the direction, because I do think Joe Alt is in a lot of ways the quote unquote generational type at left tackle position. Moving him to right tackle is obviously a question, but I do agree, like, with how the scarcity at each position was going to play out, this path for the Chargers is becoming more clear to me than what it was even yesterday. And I do definitely agree with it. So I think it'll be interesting. I do think, obviously the premium positions come off the board relatively quickly. I do agree that we are going to see non-premium positions have some sort of sway in how the second day of the draft plays out. But I still think, the guys that we see come off the board in the second round are going to have that athletic upside type profile if they are at a premium position for sure.
Right. And so we kind of touched on it. I think we've done a good job of summarizing what to expect for the teams. And so let's kind of move into kind of our final segment here. And that is focusing on the quarterbacks. We've done a lot of focusing on the quarterbacks in the pre-draft of those top quarterbacks. They're all gone. Now I'm excited to spend a little more time on this. Another question from Asa, which will start with the Rat Pack. I think all three of us enjoy Spencer Rattler and think that he may be kind of the Jalen Hurts, Dak Prescott of this class. I think there's a lot of names on here that could be in that mold. You look at Michael Pratt, obviously. I've been around very closely, has an NFL profile. You look at Jordan Travis, who I've talked about in some of the podcasts, in that Florida State team, which I think may be like, the Villanova that we saw play the Villanova quote unquote team we saw with the Knicks now that is playing, where it's a bunch of guys who are people were low on, and then all of a sudden they're all NFL guys. You have Joe Milton, who obviously is almost kind of like Jamarcus Russell light, where we didn't really see a lot of things in college, but he has the booming NFL arm and the booming NFL prospects. And so let's start with Spencer Rattler. Tej, what do you think the best spot for him is, and how early do you think he goes?
Yeah, so I think when you look at this quarterback class, you look at every single quarterback that's going to be taken over the course of this weekend. If they all hit their 50th percentile median outcomes, Spencer Rattler doesn't really become much in the league, right? Like I think maybe he's a backup. He kind of moves around. If they hit their 80th, 85th percentile outcomes, all of them, Spencer Rattler might be the QB3, QB2 in this class, just because like he would have so much talent, and his arm strength and his ability to maneuver the pocket is like something that it's much harder to develop once you're in the NFL. So like if he hits his high end outcome, that high end outcome is a lot higher than I think someone like Michael Penix or Bo Nix would have, just because of the tools that he has available to him, being a 5-star recruit, overcoming some of his offensive line woes and scheme woes last year. So that's why like I'm excited about him. If a team like the Rams takes him, I think the Rams would be perfect for him, because he can sit behind Matthew Stafford for a year or two. He can really learn a great offensive system from Sean McVay. And then you'll have him step into a situation where he'll be thrown to Puka Nacua, and you assume that the Rams will add weapons over time. They obviously made a lot of investment in their interior offensive line this year. And I don't know if Matthew Stafford at his age can play a full 17 like he used to be able to when he played basically every game from 2011 until 2019 for the Lions, where he did miss a couple games last year. Rams offense was awful without him. So you really saw his impact. So maybe Rattler can come in those games and at least, give a little bit of over half of what Matthew Stafford provides to the Rams right now.
Right. That's great insight. And I think there's talking about this kind of accumulation of quarterback capital. If the Rams are able to add someone who they like, and if that person is a Rattler or Pratt or someone like that, it's going to be very interesting to see, that Puka Nacua, Kyron Williams, they have kind of the build, and they have definitely the coach who we've seen develop Jared Goff. We've seen win a Super Bowl with Matt Stafford. I think there's a lot of good situations that are possibly out there in that vein. Ben, what are your kind of thoughts on where some of these quarterbacks may play out, and how is it a developed situation? Is it a start now situation? I know we had Sean in here saying that Pratt gives the Giants as good, if not a better chance than Daniel Jones in 2024. Is that something you agree with? How do you think it plays out?
I think it's a good question. To me, I would want to see it in training camp in the preseason before really making that sort of decision. But I do think it's a reason why you should get the guy in the building, right? If you have any of those thoughts in mind, like that's a reason why you should go up and draft him. So I do, going back to it, I do think the Giants with Michael Pratt in particular are a really good fit. A fit for me for Spencer Rattler. I think it kind of going to your team, Sam, it is the New Orleans Saints at pick 45, basically. Like I think obviously Derek Carr is in the building right now. What he provides to the Saints is, is still in some ways up in the air, but I think they have intriguing pieces, offensively. Chris Olave seemed, it maybe took a little bit of a step back last year, but in his rookie season looked like he could easily develop into one of the best wide receivers in football. I think Rashid Shaheed as well, like deep receiving threat, could be kind of a perfect complement with the Spencer Rattler in that sort of offense. So I think based on just like team need, where they sit at in the NFC South as well, I think taking a shot on Spencer Rattler is going to provide one of the best situations for him to develop into at least a somewhat productive longer-term starter. So I do think the New Orleans Saints, I think it's pick 45 that they have today. It is very much like the spot that I would be looking for with Spencer Rattler to come off the board early in day 2.
Right now, especially that they're bringing in a new offensive coordinator, Clint Kubiak, and you have Derek Carr kind of locked up for 2-3 years now that there's a restructure. That's the expectation, at least. It could be very similar, to where the Falcons are now that they have Penix, except you use that day 2, day 3 draft capital on it, or second or third round, obviously in day 2. And there's less of, the media pressure, which people say they ignore, but definitely does make a difference in the decision-making. To play that guy immediately. And then even to the point, Jordan Love was a late first-round draft pick, and there was still even pressure there. But they have Jay Kaner in the building. This is something that they've done. They drafted an Ian Book years ago with the Saints. And they've typically had pretty good backup quarterbacks in the building, and it's not been looked at as a threat or a major media issue. Sad Jameis has left, but hopefully he goes to greener pastures at the Browns. If Spencer Rattler can come in and give the just sheer vibes and just pure quote culture guy to be in the room and preaching to the choir, fishing in the Gulf and all that stuff, Spencer Rattler may become my favorite player. But it'll be interesting to see how the Saints play out. And so to kind of end this segment, guys, I've listed out some of these names, Spencer Rattler, Michael Pratt, Jordan Travis, Joe Milton, maybe even a Sam Hartman, maybe someone we haven't even considered yet. If you're a dynasty player and in a tough league, who is someone you're keeping an eye on as someone who may be an impact player this year or in the future in that dynasty league, Tej?
That is a really good question. I think it's Jordan Travis. Eric has talked about him before too on some of these other shows. Like, I am a little surprised no one's talked about Jordan Travis this entire draft process. I get, I love your analogy about Villanova, and like now we see it with the Nova Knicks and how well so many of those guys have done in basketball. And when you look at Jordan Travis, like, highly productive, pretty athletic. Obviously coming off a major injury, and that might be affecting him. But like, it is a little strange that someone that led a Florida State team to an undefeated season and unfortunately didn't get to see the end of that. Like, it just hasn't been talked about in this draft. So like, that's someone I would look at as someone maybe who could come in and be like a tush push guy for a team where you're maybe getting half a rushing touchdown from him every week or something. Like, I think he'll be really interesting to follow in this draft. Joe Milton, again, like, if everyone hits their median outcomes, he's probably not going to last in the league that long. If there is a scenario where he hits his 95th percentile outcome, you are looking at a top end quarterback in the league. It's just that window is so small for him. Right. It's so narrow because of how poor his accuracy is. But he obviously has all the talent in the world. So maybe a team, I think that was suggested to me on Twitter by someone, was like, maybe the Chiefs take him in the 6th or 7th, try to develop him a little bit. He plays like a week 18 game when they've already locked up their seed, and like they try to flip him for like a 3rd or 4th. Like, maybe that's an option. Like, I don't really know where a good spot for him to go would be, because he's like probably not going to be starting, but like it'll be interesting to see how the league views him.
Yeah, for sure. And Ben, what are your thoughts about what kind of the best plays are there?
Yeah, I think for me, and especially if you're on a dynasty perspective and you play, super flex basically, so you can start 2 quarterbacks, like, you are very much gravitating towards upside with some of your later dart throws in the fantasy draft. And obviously guys like Joe Milton, Spencer Rattler, like, very much going to be in that 3rd, 4th round of rookie drafts. And I think there's a case to be made for catering to upside in those particular situations. Obviously, depending on the situation that they arrive in, but I think taking a couple of those dart throws is the correct approach. To me, I don't think there's like a ton else from this quarterback class that could really have that sort of upside case to gravitate towards. I do kind of, I do think, Tej is kind of along the right tracks with Jordan Travis, but to me, like, there's just not the upside case of him being a starter at the NFL level for 17 games a season and being, a top 20 quarterback. And I think there's at least a scenario where that could maybe happen for both Spencer Rattler and Joe Milton, maybe. But yeah, that's kind of my evaluation of, I think if you just, along those lines, going back to a guy I discussed earlier, but Jermaine Burton as well towards the end of your dynasty drafts, I think is somebody who could develop into a pretty decent NFL wide receiver and would be the spot I'd gravitate towards with those, 3rd and 4th round draft picks.
Right. And again, I think that's great fantasy insight. For the final time, just want to plug our sponsor, our partner in this whole endeavor of being in Detroit, covering each analytical element of the draft very tightly, and that's Underdog Fantasy. Use promo code SUMER, SUMER, for 100% match up to $100. And guys, now I'm going to do what I've been waiting to do for about 2 days, and that is just cut a promo against New York pizza in favor of Detroit pizza. It's almost lunchtime. You have New York.
So hungry.
You have New York pizza. You have the triangular slice. You have the crispiness, and it's on every corner. But unfortunately, the quality is just not there. You get a great Detroit pizza in that lovely square pan, and it's crispy. It's a little doughy. You get that little spicy Detroit seasoning on it. Great pepperoni, cheese. You can't beat it. And so, guys, the question to close this: where are we going to lunch?
Buddy's Pizza. I have to. But I mean, the way that you've just broke down the two different types of pizza, like the draft prospects, was the best part of this entire show. Yeah. Now, I mean, I wrote this. Where should we go for lunch in the doc? Just because I was really hungry, and now I think I'm even hungrier after hearing your evaluation there.
Yeah, we have been on the grind, the draft grind. I haven't eaten in 24 hours. So I'm definitely ready for some pizza.
Yeah, and definitely for anyone in the audience who may be in Detroit, who may know Detroit, we all love food, or we all love to have fun. If there's some great things that you'd like to see us go to, and maybe we'll tweet about it or something, let us know in the comments, in the replies. Tell us what we have coming up. Do we have more shows, Tej? Tell us what we have coming up.
Well, I think everyone should check out what our colleague Sean Syed is doing right now.
For sure.
He's doing 5 to 10 minute hits with different media or fans of teams all across the league, really hearing their thoughts after day one on the draft, what it could mean for day two. He was phenomenal in the interview room yesterday. For someone who was trained to be a lawyer, and for him to have as good of a journalistic instinct as he does is super impressive to me. I thought his content was awesome. And then we'll be back tomorrow really recapping the draft. I think that'll be a lot of fun to talk about our winners of the draft. I've definitely thought about that a lot over the past couple of drafts, like how we want to assign winners, whether it's analytically, whether it's anecdotally. I think we can do a combination of both. So I think that we can have a lot of fun tomorrow night after the draft wraps up. We'll probably go live sometime during round 6, round 7, and really just recap some of our favorite picks and our favorite drafts.
Yeah, we're crossing that hour 15 mark here. Guys, if you're not following or subscribed to Sumer Sports on YouTube, on Twitter, make sure you do that, because I think obviously I'm biased hosting a podcast and working with these absolutely brilliant data scientists and content contributors next to me, and obviously Sean, who's grinding right now. I think it's one of the best views of really all sides of the draft, as well as just some fun and some comedy and some fun stuff that we're doing here. And so subscribe, like, follow all the guys up here, and Sean, who's delivering some great content. Eric and Thomas did a great job yesterday. 4 hours they hung in there like prize fighters, breaking down some awesome picks. Obviously, a huge thanks to our friends at Underdog Fantasy, and from Tej Seth, Ben Brown, Sam Brookhouse. Stay tuned. We will be back, but thank you for today, and we hope we helped you out a little bit. Have a good one.